Good morning, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting alchemical lights. Make sure I'm talking about the right one. Alright, today I'm going to hit some watery details, mermaid flesh tone, peacock eyes in detail, and then work some of the highlights on the central figure. And this one's getting pretty close. I also need to do an aura around this tree and the leaves. Intensify that.
You want to do something,
and then a few more minor details, shadows for the trees on this background hill that are emanating from these scale bubble patterns. But other than that, it's getting pretty close. So we'll see how far we can get in this session, and might wrap this one up in another day or two, or possibly today if I feel more motivated. I woke up pretty early and. I may need a nap. I just may need a nap. So anyway, feeling okay right now. We're caffeinated, so let's get a little action on here.
I'm giving a talk right now. I'm not getting paid to eat fruit in front of you. So that's okay, because it's a part of my brain right here that says, okay, Gabo, you may be hungry, but that's not appropriate to grab that food. That's impulse regulation. Now, kids with ADD don't have impulse regulation. Adults with addiction don't have impulse regulation, and I'll talk about that later. And there's another large group of human beings who completely lack impulse regulation. Absolutely lack it. And what do we call those people? Did you say politicians? Yeah. We won't go there. Even larger than that. We call them young children. Infants have absolutely no impulse regulation. What does that tell us? It tells us that impulse regulation has to develop. It has to develop. Now, if a plant in your backyard was not developing, what questions would you ask yourself? You'd ask yourself, what conditions are lacking that promote the healthy development of that plant? Nutrition, minerals, irrigation, sunlight. You wouldn't necessarily make that plant wrong for not developing. You would simply say, what are the conditions that are needed here? Is it possible that when we look at the poor impulse regulation of the addict and the poor impulse regulation of the ADD child, not as diseases, but as failures of development? And as soon as you ask, why didn't something develop properly? What are you actually asking? You're asking, what happened to you? What were the conditions under which your brain developed? How come that the impulse regulation that should have developed didn't? That's a developmental question. And then the second question then is, given that it didn't develop in the first place and it should have, what conditions do you need right now to help you develop those capacities? So what if we looked at this is where the promotion of resilience comes in. What if we looked at these human problems not as inherited diseases or diseases at all, but as problems of development? Then the question to be asking ourselves, what conditions do we have to provide to promote healthy development? Not how do we fix this condition, how to suppress the symptoms, but how do we provide the healthy conditions? So, I was diagnosed with ADD in my 50s, and as I described in my book on ADHD, Scattered Minds, on the very day I first heard about ADD, and I didn't know anything about it, I was a typical physician, knew nothing about it, but a friend of mine told me that she had just been diagnosed with it, and I recognized myself in her description, and the very day I took Ritalin in a higher than recommended dose. Now, how could I do this? I could do this because I'm a doctor, you see. So you're not supposed to do this, but I did. I went to one of my colleagues. I was working in palliative care at the time. I went to one of my colleagues and said, hey, Bev, I think I got ADD. Can you give me some Ritalin? And she said, sure, how much do you want? And so under the principle that if a little bit of Ritalin is good, then more Ritalin is even better, I took a higher than recommended dose on the very first day I heard about ADD. And I went home. My wife, who blessedly has just left the audience, she'll be back later. As soon as I took the Ritalin, I felt present and grounded instead of this hyperactive jumping on that my mind always does. I was just there, and I was full of insight and love. And Ray, my wife, said to me, "You look stoned." So I did go see a psychiatrist. I was properly diagnosed, and the Ritalin didn't work for me, but I was given dexedrine, which is a stimulant, and that helped me. I became a much more efficient workaholic, and wrote my first books with it. It really did help. But what stimulants do, like Ritalin and dexedrine and Adderall and all these anti-ADD drugs that kids are getting in large quantities these days, is they elevate the level of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. And dopamine is an essential brain product, which I'll tell you about shortly. And it promotes incentive and therefore attention. And there are other substances that elevate dopamine. All the stimulants do. Nicotine does. Caffeine does. Crystal meth does. Cocaine does. Now, on the downtown east side, it would not be unusual for me to have a client come in and say, "Doc, I don't get it, but most people, they do crystal meth and they go haywire. Me, I calm down and I clean my room." They were handing me the diagnosis on a platter. Their substance use was a self-medication for ADD. And it's been shown in studies that about 30% of stimulant users actually meet the criteria pre-drug use of attention deficit disorder. So right now I'm talking about, so if you're drinking 6 cups a day of coffee, you might as well just diagnose yourself. Now, what I'm talking about now is addictions on the second level, which is that of self-medication. So people self-medicate ADD, and by the way, ADD is a major risk factor for addiction. It's a major risk factor for addiction. People self-medicate anxiety, of course, with tranquilizers, with marijuana, with opiates. People self-medicate social phobia or social anxiety with alcohol. People self-medicate bipolar illness, saliently with alcohol. Because alcohol, Vincent van Gogh, the great Dutch painter, he was an alcoholic, he had bipolar illness, and the alcohol brought up his lows and soothed his highs. So that's a common self-medication for people with bipolar disorder. And saliently, people self-medicate depression. When you give them fluoxetine or paroxetine or other antidepressants, the use of which is doubled, as I said, in Britain in the last 10 years. That elevates the level of a chemical in the brain called serotonin. Cocaine elevates it temporarily as well. So people self-medicate depression with cocaine. And saliently, people self-medicate post-traumatic stress disorder with opiates. So in North America at least, and I don't know what the situation in Britain is, but I suspect it's rather the same, that these soldiers who come back from our various adventures in the Far East with post-traumatic stress disorder, they self-medicate a lot with opiates, they become opiate addicts. So on the second level, addiction is self-medication, in many cases. Now let's dive a bit deeper into it now, into the brain. Why is it that the opiate works actually? So opiates have been used in human medicine now for at least 3,000 years. That's the earliest written record of it in China. Opiates are, of course, the most powerful pain relievers that we have. But the opiates don't only soothe physical pain, they also soothe emotional pain. As a matter of fact, the part of the brain that experiences the suffering of physical pain also experiences the suffering of emotional pain. You can see this on brain scans. When you subject people to emotionally hurtful experiences while they're undergoing a brain scan, such as excluding them from a game, the same part of the brain lights up as would light up as if you stuck them with a knife. So pain is pain. And so the opiates soothe that pain. As a matter of fact, if you look at the drugs, it's rather interesting. Cocaine itself is a pain reliever. It's a local anesthetic. It numbs nerve endings. Alcohol has analgesic properties, so does marijuana. And I maintain that all the practices of addiction, whether they involve substances or not, are actually attempted as escapes from emotional pain, from discomfort, from suffering of some kind. And hence, and this is my mantra, if you remember this line, please do, the first question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And if you understand why people's pain exists in them so powerfully, you have to look at their lives, and by God, you have to look at their childhoods. Now, why is it that the opiates even work in the human brain? But this is really crucial to understanding addiction. The opiates work in the human brain because they resemble chemicals that we have ourselves in our brains, and therefore our brains have receptor sites for them, sites where they exert their effect. So we have an internal opiate system, and our internal opiates are called endorphins. And endorphin means endogenous or internal morphine-like substance. So we have our internal morphine-like substances. Why? To understand addiction, look at what the endogenous morphine-like substances do for us. What do the endorphins do? What are their roles in the human body? Many. From the gut, to the mucous membranes, to the immune system. Nature uses the same chemical for many different purposes. But in the brain, and when it comes to addiction, what do? Well, first of all, pain relief. So the so-called placebo effect, when you give 100 people an inert tablet, which they think contains a painkiller, and 25% of them will get pain relief, as if you gave them a morphine tablet. They're not imagining the effect. The very belief that they're getting help will trigger endorphin relief in them. And those endorphins are providing the pain relief. So pain relief, physical and emotional, is the first job of the endorphins. Their second job is to make possible the experience of pleasure and reward, of elation, of joy. So in these high elated, high charged states, we have a lot of endorphin activity in our brains. That's the second thing they do. Now think about those things. How important is that? Pain relief is essential for human life. You couldn't live without it. Pleasure, reward, joy are essential in human life. As the philosopher John Hobbes said, life is short, nasty, and brutish. Or maybe he said short, nasty, and British. I'm not sure. But it is tough life, as we all know. We have to have some pleasure, some joy in it. That's their second function. And their third function is the most important one of all. They make possible a little thing without which life is not possible, and that little thing is called love. And by love here, I don't mean the gooey romantic sentiments, although that's nothing wrong with that. I'm talking about actually the attachment, the pull that drives two bodies together. Now I have to dwell on this for a moment. Gravity is an attachment force. Gravity pulls me towards the earth. It also pulls the earth towards me, which ensures that I'm grounded and I'm not going to float away into the stratosphere. Gravitational force is an attachment force. In human life, attachment is an instinctive, biologically determined dynamic that we share with birds and other mammals that pulls two bodies together for the purpose of being taken care of or for the purpose of taking care of the other. So there's an attachment drive. Darren was talking about his son and his adventures with his intestines this morning. And the comedian Jerry Seinfeld, the American comedian Jerry Seinfeld, became a parent, 20 years ago or 18 years ago, and he said, it's tough being a parent. He says, it's strange. He says, you're in a room with a human being, and he looks at you, and he's smiling at you, and he's pooping his pants at the same time. You're a 2-year-old, you know? So parents have to put up with a lot of shit, to point of view. What is it that keeps them going? It's that attachment drive to want to take care of the child. The endorphins help to make that possible. Not by themselves, but they're essential to it. So in a particular experiment, they took mice in a laboratory. Genetically, they knocked out their endorphin receptors, so they had no endorphin activity. These little mice, on separation from their mothers, did not cry for help. What would that mean in the wild? It would mean their death. That's how important the endorphins are. And it wasn't, just like somebody said, that their addiction served to get them out of their loneliness in the downtown east side. I would ask people, what does the heroin do for you? And the kind of answers I would get would be, the first time I did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug. Or, Doc, I don't know how to tell you this. This is a 6'2" guy with tattoos and muscles and earrings and the whole bald head and the whole thing. I said, what does the heroin do for you? He said, Doc, I don't know how to tell you this, but it's like you're 3 years old and you're shivering with a fever and your mother puts you on her lap and wraps you in a warm blanket and gives you some warm chicken soup. That's what the heroin feels like. No, take that away from people. Put a sign on the wall saying, just say no. And see how far you're going to get. Punish them for having, for some reason, come to the conclusion that without that chemical, they will not experience those states. So that's the opiates. I mentioned the stimulants, elevating dopamine level. Let me tell you about another mouse experiment. This little mouse in the laboratory, you put food in front of him. He's hungry. He hasn't been fed. He will not budge to eat the food. In fact, will starve to death. Why? Because genetically, they knocked out his dopamine receptors. And dopamine is the incentive motivation chemical. Dopamine flows when we're exploring a novel object, a novel environment. You know, Dan was talking about his 3-year-old picks up every acorn and looks at every leaf and look at that flower, Daddy. High dopamine state of seeking and exploring. It's essential for human life. Dopamine flows when we're seeking food, when we're seeking a sexual partner. And by the way, let me pause here and talk to you about the process addictions, the addictions that don't involve drugs, like gambling, like sex addiction, like shopping addiction. What are those about? I've had a shopping addiction problem myself. I talk about it in the book. And I tell you, when I was involved in my shopping addiction, there was no ADD. I was totally present. I was focused, highly motivated. I remembered everything. I remember to this day almost everything I bought and when and where. This was for CDs. That was my particular focus of addiction. Because I had high dopamine state. It's not that people are addicted to shopping. It's not what they're buying that they're addicted to. Because what they buy never satisfies them, and as soon as they finish buying one thing, they have to buy something else. Same with the gambler, same with the sex addict. If sex addiction was simply about sex, the solution would be straightforward. And I don't mean to be in any way jolly about a very serious condition, but if sex was the issue in sex addiction, the solution would be to find another sex addict. And then you'd be okay for the rest of your life. But that's not what it's about. It's about seeking. It's about that high dopamine state of elation and focus and incentive and vitality and being alive. And the question is, why don't you feel alive already? What happened to you? So that's dopamine. I mentioned 2 other circuits in addiction, and then we'll finish for now. I mentioned already impulse regulation. It was actually, I think, a Scottish physician who said that the problem of addiction is not lack of free will, but lack of a free won't. Because what happens is that if you look at brain scans on drug addicts, or any kind of addicts actually, the impulse regulation circuits in the brain are functioning well, as I already mentioned. And later on I'll talk to you about why not. And then stress regulation. Right? If you look at your own addictive history, when you were okay for a while, you were not using or engaging in the behavior for a while, and then you relapsed. Most of the time, the reason you relapsed is because there's something stressful happened to you, which means that you didn't know how to regulate your stresses. The stress regulation mechanism in your brain had not developed properly. Now, why didn't it develop properly? Well, you know what? I'm going to go into this next and go just a couple of minutes over time, and then I'll pause because I want to just finish this piece. I'll tell you very quickly why those things don't develop. Because the human brain develops under the impact of the environment. We know this. This isn't. I was going to say it's not brain science, but it is brain science. This is state-of-the-art brain science, not controversial. We've known this for decades, at least 2 decades now. It's no longer debated, and it's not taught in the medical schools. If somebody told me that what I'm about to tell you is taught in the local medical schools, I'd be so delighted to be proven wrong. But in North America, I'm telling you, I have yet to find a medical school where they teach this stuff, even though it's been published in major medical journals. So I'm going to quote from an article that appears in the journal Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And the article is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. You couldn't find a more prestigious university and more prestigious institution. And this article appeared in 2012. And here's what they said about brain development. Summing up decades of consensus on brain research. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Let me go through that again. So the point is that the human brain develops under the impact of the environment. And the right conditions have to be there. And just as if you were a gardener looking at that little plant in your backyard, the development of the human creature depends even more on the environment. It's even more fragile. It's even more sensitive to what happens. And so which circuits develop? The endorphin circuits, the dopamine circuits, self-regulation, stress regulation, emotional balance, insight, all the functions of the midfrontal cortex. Depends on the environment. Just as if you take a child with perfectly good eyes at birth and you put him in a dark room for 5 years and he doesn't see light, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life because the circuits of vision require light waves. These emotional circuits and self-regulatory circuits also need the right environment. And that's because the human brain has to develop on the outside of the womb mostly, compared to a horse which can run on the first day of life. We can't do that for a year and a half, 2 years. So much depends on the environment. So they say the architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth. What does that mean? It means that the prevention of addiction needs to begin at the first prenatal visit at least. Because already what happens to pregnant women has a huge impact on a child's brain development. We know this from animal studies and multiple human studies. So women who are stressed or abused during pregnancy, their kids' brains don't develop properly. Too much cortisol, too much stress hormone is present, and that impedes brain development of essential circuits. This is true before birth and after birth as well. Which also explains why adopted kids are at so much higher risk. Double the risk of suicide, multiple the risk of ADHD, multiple the risk of depression, and so on. Why? Because by definition, they came from a stressed uterus. Any woman that is to give up a baby for adoption is by definition stressed. A single mom, a teenage mom, a poor mom, an addicted mom, an abused mom. Those kids are getting stress hormones throughout the pregnancy. And then they have this tremendous loss of the separation from the birth mother, about which I'll talk to you later. But that should tell us something about the care system as well, of what we're playing with here. when we separate kids from their parents, and what we have to keep in mind. So, this process begins before birth, continues into adulthood, which brings us to education. Those of you, I used to be a high school teacher, by the way. I decided that was too stressful, so I went to medical school. And I taught high school for 3 years. The schools think they're in the business of giving people skills and facts. No, they're not. That's not their proper business. Their proper business is the promotion of healthy brain development. Because the healthy brain will be curious and acquisitive of knowledge, spontaneous.
Oh shit. Well, that ate up the whole clip and I didn't get to the highlights on the skin or clothing. But
I'll talk more about education later, discipline and all this.
I might wrap it up here anyway and do that later. And just work on it off camera a little bit. And then do a final session for the tree aura and other details rather than clipping together another session right now. So I'm going to wrap that up here. Let me zoom in and show you what I did with the peacock there. It's getting a little better, as well as the detail overall. We got some mermaid skin tones happening. Looking a little more dimensional. The hands are much cleaner now. We got the peacock back to peacock form rather than just a big smear of light. But I want him kind of glowy, so I may reglaze him, but I'm kind of liking him as he is. He probably just needs a little more detailing. And then I took the water forms and just sort of tapered them away from this watery edge by his elbow that's sort of informing this seascape where the mermaid is inhabiting the cauldron of the alembic, I guess is what you would call it, of the composition. Snakes getting a little better. Trees, I still need to shadow the trees and aura this tree and do a little detail on him. But it's getting close. So that's it for the moment. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting alchemical light. Have a good day, everyone.